to introduce her book, okay? Kissing the Crisis. And this is a really good book, and today she's going to give you a special discount. All right? It was 15, now it's 10. All right? And so I think that you all will really enjoy this. Let me tell you, the Kissing Crisis. Field notes on foul-mouthed babies, disenchanted women. I mean, what else is there? All right. And creamy middle age. Well, what makes you disenchanted is our sex. All right. So if there's no other business to take care of, come up.
That's it, we'll have to get there.
My name is Carol Bachman. And yes, I am from Louisiana, Mississippi. I lived
Having a little trouble here.
Okay. I was saying I am from Louisiana, Mississippi, because I lived, I want to say about 15 years on the coast, including during Katrina. And that's why I'm excited to be here, because I'm going to pass back through and I'm going to see some friends tonight that I haven't seen in a very long time. So first thing I'll say is don't expect me to say anything funny, because it's not going to happen. And that's kind of the point of what I'm talking about today, which is that a lot of people think they can't write funny because they think you have to be like a stand-up comic. And what they don't realize is that it's a very different skill set. Writing humor is not at all like performing stand-up. It's not about telling one-liners and having charisma. I mean, you see, I don't have any of that. And I got, I'm on a publisher for my book of humor. It's more about understanding technique and about not being afraid, I think, to sometimes embarrass yourself if you're writing in the first person. Not being afraid to tell truths or maybe say something that might upset someone. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is humor and why you shouldn't be afraid to try it. I want to start out, first by talking about why humor is important. And I'm going to actually read kind of a lengthy quote from a writer named Leanne Jeshaway. She's a comedian and an author of 21 books. And she has won the Irma Bombeck Award for Humor. And I'm sure a lot of you guys know who Irma Bombeck is. She's kind of my hero as a writer. And if you want to learn how to write funny, she's the person you should be reading, as far as I'm concerned. But the Irma Bombeck Writers Workshop is one of the, probably the premier organization particularly for female writers who write humor in the first person. And there's a fantastic website. They have a conference every 2 years where all these funny ladies from all over the whole United States, down in Ohio, at the University of Dayton, and just talk about the craft of writing a humor essay. So for the purposes of today, I'm primarily talking about humor in the first person, creative nonfiction, essays, memoir, that sort of format. I'm not going to address humor in fiction because I haven't written fiction, so I don't know a single thing about that. Okay. But this quote from Leanne Jeshaway is, "You may think that when it comes to writing, humor is best used only in fiction or satire. But while we think of comedy in terms of exaggeration or fabrication, effective humor can be just as much about creative misdirection." And that's a phrase to really keep in mind. "Engaging readers by taking them someplace they don't expect to go, and subtly choosing metaphors and words that make readers giggle without even knowing why. And a smiling reader is one who's paying attention and eager to read on. Sociologists, linguists, and biologists say that our ability to laugh and desire to do so isn't all fun and games, but actually serves two essential life functions: to bond with members of our tribe and to lessen tension and anxiety. Both of these are also excellent reasons to incorporate humor into your nonfiction. As a communication tool, effective use of humor can humanize you, cementing your bond with readers. It can also help your work stand out in a crowded market, and as advertising studies have shown, humor enhances how much we like what we're reading and how well we remember it afterward. So, yeah, a long bunch of blah, 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 but basically, the point is, when it's done well, I think humor does a lot to close gaps. It sometimes brings people closer together. It makes us feel connected. For instance, if I can make you laugh at something ridiculous that happened to me, you might feel like, oh wow, that happened to me too. So it's a way of oftentimes connecting. And I think one thing people are afraid of is writing. I think a lot of the time people think they have to have these zany, crazy, incredible stories in their life. And I think, well, my life's kind of small, I don't have silly things happening to me. What am I going to write about? And one of the things I really want to stress is that every person in this room has something they can write about that's funny. You might not know it, because it isn't always what happens in reality that matters. What makes it funny is how you interpret that event that took place. So that's, I think, a really important thing of all creative nonfiction, especially the essay form, is that what makes it interesting is oftentimes not the event, it's your interpretation of it or how you share it. So to give an example, I am going to read today something of my own. It's not from my book, but it will give you a taste of my writing. This actually appeared a couple years ago in a newspaper for humorists called Funny Times. And it was the first time I ever had anything funny in print. And I was so excited because in the masthead it was like Dave Barry, Karabach. My name was right next to Dave Barry, so I lost it. But unfortunately, for anyone who's still eating donuts, it is scatological humor. So, you might want to stop eating for a few minutes. And as a method to the madness, I'm reading this as an example. Here's what I want you to be listening for. This is a very tiny little event from my childhood that has happened to probably everyone in this room before. And you would think, hey, you can't write about something like that because it's not interesting, it's not unique. But someone in here can write an awesome essay right now that's hilarious about what we're doing at this moment. So it's not, again, if I could just stress that, it's not about the event, it's about how you interpret it as a writer. So this essay is called Shame Hat. There's a couple of curse words too, so I once wiped my ass with a souvenir hat from the city of Chicago. It was a lovely hat. It was white and featured colorful line drawings of landmarks. The Sears Tower was on the front. Around the sides were the skyline and some Frank Lloyd Wright house or another, and a depiction of green water spanned by a machine-age era bridge. Although I'm no fan of Chicago, the act of wiping my rear with its visage was not intended as a slight. I didn't set out to choose the city as a target. I wiped Chicago because I was a kid. When you're a kid, you never remember to check for the toilet paper supply. You just go. And when you go and discover moments later that there is no way to maintain cleanliness for the rest of the school day, you do the only thing that makes sense. Remove from your head the souvenir hat your parents bought from a recent vacation, and you set things straight. The next rational step, the one involving disposing of said Chicago souvenir, leaves a lot up to debate. Despite being only a kid, you intelligently imagine that flushing it will not work. Excuse me, Mrs. Smith? but I think the Chicago hat I just used to wipe myself may have clogged the toilet. Mrs. Smith, wait, what did you just say? I clogged the toilet with a souvenir Chicago hat. Mrs. Smith, I can't believe what I'm hearing. You're telling me that you threw a Chicago hat in the toilet? Yeah. Well, no recess for you, young lady. Atlanta, I could understand, but Chicago? You also don't want to throw it into the trash bin because everyone in the classroom had already seen you wearing it. What can you do? You're in 3rd or 4th grade and there's no way to burn the evidence without setting off the school fire alarms. You figure somehow, God only knows how, that the best plan of action is to walk into a neighboring classroom and shove it into the storage area of some other kid's desk. You never consider, until you are grown, the implications of this. You never consider what it would be like to reach into your desk to get a pencil, or a ruler, or a box of 64 crayons, and pull out a Chicago poo hat instead. You never do consider this. But when you're older, you think about it quite a lot. You wonder, who ended up with your DNA? You want to seek out this person, to apologize, to buy them some after-the-fact but well-intentioned hand sanitizer. You feel as an adopted child would while on a quest to find birth parents. You just want to know what they look like. Just want to know what they are. You want to know if they accidentally wore the hat before realizing the implications. You want to know what they looked like when they grimaced. You wonder if they were changed at all by the experience. You wonder if they are today going through a divorce. If the poo hat recipient happens to be reading this or hearing this, I hope that he or she will contact me. We are, after all, like family. I know most of you have left your own version of excrement in a desk. It's a rite of passage that we all go through at some point or another. Your hat may have been different. It may have featured a smear of something else, like ketchup or blood. It may not have even been a hat. It may have been a kerchief or an old Justice League t-shirt, or even a pair of little undies with a patch of yellow in the front. But we all had a poo hat somewhere once. I know you are now awaiting the great metaphor or analogy that seems implicit in what's written here. You're waiting for me to connect the skid marks, draw lines between the dots. You're waiting for me to say that the smelly hat somehow represents our incompetence or our innocence or something grand. You're waiting for me to explain that the smelly hat is a microcosm of some larger scheme that we are all trying to grasp. But no, it's just a hat. And honestly, I hope its recipient will someday come forward so I can put to rest this extremely important and unfinished business. So that's shameless. But the point of me selecting the most bizarro thing I've ever written to read today is to point out that it can be the tiniest, weirdest little thing that happens to all of us, and I think you have to find a way to put your spin on it and make it mean something. Make the tiniest little, make sitting there today listening to an unfunny person talking about being funny. Write about that, and you can make a great story of it. So that's the first point I want to express: is don't be scared. Don't think you're not funny, and don't think you don't have things to write about, because we all do. One thing that I learned is that, and this is a terrible thing to say for if anyone out here has written about humor and given people advice, and I'm going to give you some advice, not as any kind of expert, but just as one of you guys. But I don't think it's really that instructive. I think what's more instructive is just to read a whole bunch of funny writers. Before I decided I wanted to write humor, I sat down and I read Dave Barry, and I read Irma Bombeck, and I read a lot of, y'all probably know Jill Connor Brown, the Sweet Potato Queen, so I read her books. I read a lot of David Sedaris and people like that. And that's where I learned. And that's what I suggest to you is don't spend your money on books about humor. Just read the people who know what they're doing. And try to pay attention to it and learn from it. But in the process of paying attention and learning, here are the little tidbits that I put together. The first one is use humor sparingly. You might notice that what I just read to you is not a bunch of one-liners, and it's not ha-ha-ha funny all the time. And a lot of my book is like that. In fact, I go through long passages that are really quite serious. And that's actually one of the things that makes humor effective is that it comes out of the blue and it's unexpected. So although it says humor on the back here, I write about my mother's passing away from cancer. And I write about what happened to me when Hurricane Katrina flooded my house. So, my point is, we're not trying to be stand-up comics, and if you try to do that, you're doomed to fail. So use it sparingly. I kind of talked about this. Don't be scared to write about sad events and to make them funny, because you can. One thing that I learned is that, and I'm sure you guys all know this, that there's a really fine line between things like grief and humor, and things that are devastatingly sad in humor. And we've all used that phrase before, where we said, if I couldn't, what is it? I just said we all use it, now I can't remember. If I couldn't laugh, I would cry. Or if I couldn't laugh, I would cry. And we've all been there, where you walk in the room and your kids have like thrown every dish on the ground and broken them, and there's flour everywhere, and you're thinking, oh, this is the worst day ever, and it's horrible, but then all you can do is laugh. Well, we've all been in those situations. When my house was flooded with 4.5 feet of water, the first thing I did when I walked into it was I laughed. And so I think it's an important lesson to understand that a lot of the time humor is the one thing that makes difficult things bearable for us to write about. I can never write about things like Katrina in a serious way. It would be very difficult for me because it was a traumatic experience. But for some reason, when I write about the funny parts of it, I'm able to do that. So I would actually make the suggestion to you guys to approach something that makes you very sad and try to make it funny. Now, of course, you have to walk a fine line. You don't want to insult people, hurt people's feelings, or be offensive about a sensitive subject. But don't be scared to try that. Okay, this is a very nuts and bolts thing that I learned in the process of studying all these great humorists, is that one thing that they all do, and that I actually tried to do a little bit in my book, was to establish a pattern and then misdirect your reader. That's always so funny. For instance, if you're talking about something and they expect you to go in a certain direction, and then you take it to another place completely. There's a phrase about you. I don't know what the phrase is, but it's a concept called the rule of three. That when you list 3 items, 2 of them make sense and they go together, but then if the third one doesn't, there's an incongruent feel to it that makes the reader laugh because you said something they didn't expect. So, of course, here I'm talking again about rear ends and excrement, but I don't know why my example is this as well. But so an example would be, all day my dogs sniff butts, eat poop, and secretly know the correct answer to every question ever asked by Socrates. So that's the rule of 3. You have 2 things that we expect dogs to do, and then a third one that the reader doesn't expect to hear. And if you listen to comics and you read humorists, you see that that method is employed all the time. Yeah, and everybody does it. It could be in a one-liner like that, or it could be in an entire story. But it's all about misdirecting and putting something in a place where you don't expect it. Another method that's really effective, and you can hear it a lot in stand-up comics, is the concept of looping. Looping back around in subject matter that you talked about previously. So, for instance, if you're writing an essay on, I don't know, whatever, boys playing baseball, and you make some joke about something that happens in the dugout, well, you let your reader forget about it, and then at the end you loop back around to it. And so it's like this little piece of familiarity from earlier on that your reader didn't expect to come up again. And it often can have a humorous effect. Stand-up comics do it all the time. I don't know if you guys have heard this. They'll close out their bit with a little joke that they made an hour earlier, and they'll kind of tie it back in. It's called looping. I'm a very sarcastic person. I make a lot of statements that are like, "Oh yeah, that was great," when it was really terrible, you know. And it is a very risky thing to do, to write with sarcasm. We've all seen on Facebook how people do this and it gets misinterpreted, because the problem is that sarcasm is very much based on your voice inflection, your body language, the look on your face. And just like on Facebook where those things are missing, it's going to be missing in your writing too. So a lot of the time when I personally read something I think isn't funny, a lot of the time it's because there's a lot of use of sarcasm and it doesn't relate. I mean, it doesn't relate. It doesn't, if you don't know that they're actually not meaning what they're saying, it loses its effect. One thing that can be very effective is to state the obvious. If you consider, for instance, a comedy of Jerry Seinfeld, almost everybody in this room knows him, so I'm going to use this example. A lot of the time Jerry Seinfeld will describe very basic everyday things in the most simplistic terms. I don't have an example from him, but there's another comic that's popular right now, Louis C.K. He's filthy, but he's funny. And I saw an interview with him recently where he was talking about flying on airplanes and how we have so much, we're so ungrateful about technology and we're so ungrateful about all the things that we have. And then people will be, you know, they'll complain when they're on airplanes if everything doesn't go perfectly. And he used the phrase to describe flying, and he said, "We sit in a chair and we fly through the sky like gods." And so that's a good example of distilling an idea or a thing down to its basic description of what it is. It's riding on a chair in the sky like a god. You know, he could have said, "Oh, we're flying in an airplane," but no, he described it that way. And a lot of the time humor can come from that. It can be describing things that we do and we see every day, but using words that are so basic and so pared down that it actually seems funny. You know, like to describe a spoon as a bowl with a handle, a tiny bowl with a handle on it. You know, that's not really funny. But there are so many things in our life that if you think about their elemental nature and you describe those exact words, it's very funny. Okay, this applies not just to humor, but I think to all forms of creative nonfiction, all forms of first-person writing, is don't be afraid to exaggerate. I was in Jackson doing a workshop last weekend, or 2 weeks ago, at the Mississippi Writers Guild, and we had this big, Miss Mason was there, and were you in the room when we had the conversation? No, you weren't. That what makes your work interesting and creative is your interpretation of that real-life event. So, for instance, I'm going to give you 2 statements. And here's 2 statements. 2 people are in a room, the same room, same events, everything, you know, we're in reality here. One person's statement about what happened in the room is, "It was the most scary and stressful day that anyone could imagine. The anxiety and fear were so intense." That's person number 1's interpretation of what happened. Here's person number 2. "Everything was under control that day. It was just an average day. I was actually quite bored." So on first thought, you think, well, one of these people is out of touch with reality. There's no way these could both be true. But if you imagine that the first statement was made by a patient having a heart attack, laying on a hospital bed, and the second statement was made by his doctor, then you can very easily see how an event can be interpreted in wildly different ways. And in a sense, that makes that reality wildly different because we're all seeing it through a different set of eyes. So that's, I think, an important point to make about all creative nonfiction forums is that you're speaking from your experience of the true life event. So if you're going to get creative, and that's the creative part of creative nonfiction, is the voice and the interpretation that you bring to the real life event. So if you want to get creative and you want to exaggerate, don't exaggerate with facts. Exaggerate with that voice, and exaggerate by using metaphors and other things, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. Okay, here's two examples. So let's go back to the patient and the ER doc. Here are two ways exaggeration can be used by still staying true to the facts of what actually happened in the room. Metaphor and simile are two great ways of doing this. It is also an easy way to take things to the level of outrageous. So one example would be that patient, let's just say that patient said, "I was as scared as a priest caught with glitter on his cheek and a size 12 pink stilettos hidden in the confessional." So that's an example of exaggeration, but if you take that apart, I was as scared as, so the facts are that he was scared. That's your fact, right? And then the outrageous part is all creativity. That's you saying, I was as scared as. And that as, what follows that as, can be anything your mind can conjure. And that's where the interpretation part comes in. So don't change facts. Don't ever lie to your reader. Don't ever misrepresent. But you can go off with metaphors that make, that paint a portrait that is one of exaggeration without you actually making a fact. Did that make sense? Here's another one. Let's just have, if you're a fool. I mean, look, shame hack. Come on, look what I just read to you guys. So you have to be, if you're going to write in first person, you can't be afraid for people to know secrets or to know about you. It comes with the territory. Readers by far enjoy a writer who uses his or herself as the butt of jokes instead of using other people. And this is really, I think, important. You don't want to take this overboard, but self-deprecation is always a kind way of getting your point across without hurting other people. It's like saying, see, we're both in the same boat here, and I'm one of you. And that feeds into the idea of bringing that tribe together, to reference the tribe talked about in that first quote. So we've all seen this, and we've all read it, when someone makes unkind remarks about another person. And most of the time it's not funny, it's mean-spirited. But if you include yourself in that group or turn it on you, it takes on a whole different tone. And I think, I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you prefer? I would assume you prefer that kind of writing. One caution is, if you're writing for others, be careful to tailor the humor to the audience. Some audiences are different than others, of course. People who read erotica have a different threshold than people who read religious literature. There's humor for all groups, but make sure you know who you're speaking to. I think that's pretty self-evident. The flip side of that is that if you're too overly concerned with being politically correct or offending a single person, then humor probably isn't the thing for you. It takes a certain amount of bravery, and in particular when writing humor in the first person essay form. That's all I can really share with you. I don't know what else to say, except for don't be scared and read. In fact, I was going to put together a list of resources for you guys, and then I started really thinking about it, and I'm like, no, what you need is a reading list. It's not books about writing. You need to go out and read these great writers and think about what they're doing. So this is kind of totally self-indulgent, but this is a list of the people who have influenced me or who I feel I've learned from. I mean, there's some writers, like for instance, the Nora Ephron. A lot of people love Nora Ephron. Most women adore her. I don't really enjoy Nora Ephron. So this is, bear in mind that this list is peculiar to me. And if there's one single name, two single names on this list that I would really suggest is Irma Bombeck and David Sedaris. if you need a good Christmas gift, David Sedaris' Santaland Diaries is about the funniest thing I've ever read in my life. And it's just so funny. It's about Christmas. And his experience of being okay, another example. He was an elf one year when he was unemployed. So he was he got a temporary job as a Christmas elf. And this whole book essentially is based around an essay he wrote about being an elf and all the crazy stuff that happens when the Santa's elves. But, so we can pass this around. Does anybody have any questions that maybe I could be helpful with in any way about publishing humor first person?
I just had a comment, excuse me, Garrison Keillor.
Yes.
I think is a good example.
Garrison Keillor is another good example.
It's a little subtle.
Mhm.
I enjoy the subtle part.
I mentioned a lot of stand-up comics, but one thing that I found is a lot of the time their books aren't that good. I love Jerry Seinfeld. I love Larry David, who wrote the Seinfeld show. I love his stand-up, but I didn't enjoy his book. And it's the same, it's the opposite, the flip side of the first statement I made when I came in here, that we're not stand-up comics, we're writers, so don't try to be a stand-up comic. Well, I think people like Jerry Seinfeld and Ellen DeGeneres should be stand-up comics and not writers. Because some people are just funny, and when that's written down on the page, like 50% of the formula is so even though I reference them a lot because it was easier, I suggest reading humorists, not watching their stand-up. There it is.
I think reading Ann Landers, and I was blessed to go to a Fairhope book sale at the library and got 2 huge books on every one of her letters and another one. I'm sorry I got them, but anyway. But when you think about, okay, she writes, and this woman writes in and said, my neighbor cooks in her birthday suit, she's always naked. And Ann Landers says, well, make sure she wears an apron when she lights the oven. Well, I think that's hilarious. And I even wrote a letter to her one time about something I was in, and everybody recognized it. My sister called, my ex-husband called, and all these things, but it ended up a very funny answer that she gave. But I was blessed to take a wonderful course from a woman in Gainesville. She's a mystery writer, and she writes with some of the best that you think. But she taught a course on humor. And very first thing she said was, it is so important to do it in the first person, because if it is not, it is at somebody's expense.
Exactly.
And I have never forgotten that. She said,
That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah,
Make the joke on you. You know, I think like in my book, in the first couple of chapters, you know, I make fun of me having like a mustache. You know, I mean, that's what middle-aged women have, those kind of things. So yeah, I think that's such an important point, I think. And I've heard some really mean-spirited stuff. And just include yourself in it. In the first person sells on the
When you said mustache, I have a funny thing happen.
I actually have a mustache.
I was a principal, and one of my special students came up, and we were in the sunlight, and he felt on my lip, and he said, I have whiskers too.
Well, I've got, yeah, we're going off on stories now, but there's a photo of me when I was pregnant, because, you know, the ladies know that, you know, you get these, like, skin discolorations and stuff when you're pregnant. Well, for one of my babies, it was literally a skin discoloration that looked like a French guy with, like, a little handlebar, and it was like this. It was like this dark, you know, of course it went away like a month after I had the baby, but we have these photos of me with just these ridiculous things. So, I mean, think about little things from you, like that right there. That could be a humorous situation that you could write a story about. And, you know, think about the kinds of themes that can come from that. You could write about, I don't know, differences between men and women. You could write about kids say the darndest things. You could write about you could probably make a list, if you really tried, of 20 different angles, that one little anecdote, 20 different angles you could take to turn that anecdote into an interesting piece for other people to read. One thing that, I'm rambling now, but one thing that I think is so important, that one of my jobs, I write for the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and then September reporter. I used to be a community editor, and I edit a parenting magazine that's distributed across the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And one of the things I have to do is I have to read a lot of essays that are submitted by writers. And most of them we cannot use. And one of the reasons is their first person work is simply telling stories about their life. And the missing formula there that they don't understand is an effective essay doesn't just tell a story about your life, but it universalizes it, where it has to have meaning or make other people think. One of the things that I found is that a lot of bloggers are guilty of this, because by nature a blog is kind of like a diary entry, and so they tend to, especially moms, poor moms, I feel sorry for them. I'm not pinpointing moms, it's just that they happen to do a lot of blogging. A lot of the time, the mommy bloggers are just kind of like, this is what happened today, and my kid threw up, and this other one wouldn't eat their vegetables, and then it ends there. And it could be very well written, someone who really has a command of the language, but no one wants to read a lamentation about what happened in their kitchen with their kids that day. But we do want to read it if it goes beyond that. It makes a point or makes you think about another subject. So I think that is, for me personally, that's always the missing magic piece in an effective piece of first person, is you have to always ask the question, so what? Okay, there's your story. So what? Why do I care about this? What am I going to learn from it? What is the moral of the story for me as a reader? And when I started asking that question of my own writing, I think it made a big difference for me personally.
Hold up your hand, Micah. Micah.
What have you read, or of course you've read, but what is your thinking about Mark Twain?
I haven't read Twain since I was in college, a really long time ago. I'm going to be honest, I think he has fantastic one-liners and stuff. I mean, American culture couldn't do without Mark Twain, but I don't read Twain as a regular thing. It's just not, I don't connect with a lot of it.
Probably.
I enjoyed it back then, but I don't
In the
want
context
to.
of the times, it was
Yeah.
funnier.
Exactly. But a lot of, to talk about something I just brought up is Seinfeld. I look at the old episodes and I think, wow, that was only less than 20 years ago, and it was so funny when it aired on TV. And now it's kind of like, I always say, I remember that being a lot funnier than it is now. But we do that to everything. When you look at the old TV shows from when you were a kid, and it's just, there's a time and place for humor, and it changes, I think,
When you were a kid and you were watching Mickey Mouse,
Right.
those were
Exactly.
funny cartoons. and
Yeah, it was
stuff like
funny.
that.
Tom and Jerry.
Hilarious.
Yeah, look at Tom and Jerry now. What is that?
Don't you think that do you find that different nationalities have different approaches to humor? For example, my family, my grandparents, they were all from Italy. It was very scatological.
Yeah.
All the jokes were around crap and.
Well, they would have liked to, whatever.
Yeah, and then when I lived in Britain, they were very, very self-deprecating. To the point where I was kind of shocked at first. I wasn't catching the humor at first. And so do you feel that sometimes as far as your audience, sometimes you have to think about the nationality?
Oh, I think even more than, it's even on a smaller scale than that. I'm from New Orleans, okay, and we're different than a lot of people in other parts of the U.S. Like, we just say things straight up, and we don't have a lot of shame, and we like to complain, and we like to say things that we don't have a lot of social niceties about ourselves. People give you the shirt off their backs, but they'll also tell you right to your face what they think of you. So I think what you're saying is totally true. I think sometimes things like that can get lost in translation. I think, for instance, my book, I think if you're from the South, you're gonna understand it and maybe appreciate it a little bit more. But demographics are so important. That's one of the things about this book that, you know, I'm so happy I wrote it, but one of the negatives is that, it's mostly of appeal to middle-aged women, and there's a lot of men who are scared to read it, and I don't blame them. I mean, it's about a female experience of reaching midlife, and by the way, this is where I pitch my book. This is that little 2-minute segment. It's a series of 21 nonfiction essays that deal with topics related to parenting, marriage, family life, career, and the overall theme of the collection is midlife crisis. And even though I call it midlife crisis, what I like to call it is midlife maturation, because I don't think it's a crisis to look back at your life and say, what can I do better going forward? What did I do wrong in the first 40 years? You know, I'm 48 now, and I feel like in the last 5 years, just since I wrote this book, I've learned so much about myself. And, you know, it's a phase. It's a phase. But my point is, celebrate it. Celebrate being middle-aged. Celebrate making those changes. Celebrate your kids going out, going out of the house, and you develop new hobbies, and you recreate your life. So.
There was
That's the
one more
point.
thing this artist said, this writer said, that writing humor must be the hardest type, because think of the early deaths of all these humor writers right now.
Most people who write humor are very sad people.
Yes,
Truth
and
be
they
told.
die early death.
Yeah.
Just think about the women and men, and it's hard to write that.
How many humors have y'all seen in interviews where you were shocked at how negative and dour they were?
Robin Williams.
Robin Williams is a prime example. Most people, and it kind of gets back to the point that I was making about sadness and fear and grief and depression and humor, and all these things are wrapped up together. And I think that's sometimes why people are scared of humor, because they think it's a thing unto itself, and really these things are all together and they all blend. And you can write that way. I mean, when I had my book launch, I decided to read the chapter, and my friends and family, these acquaintances over there, and these people for the book signing. And I had the idea to read the chapter about my mother passing away at age 52 of terminal breast cancer that was caught at stage 4. There was nothing we could do about it. And I read this chapter, which was very much like a roller coaster, because it starts out and everybody's there and they're all looking at me and they're laughing. It's really, they thought it was really funny. And then all of a sudden, here's my mother dying, like 1 second later. And I had to switch out of gear, and I'm still trying to read, and I'm laughing a little bit because I'm still in the mode of being up here at the top of the roller coaster instead of down in the trough, And but sometimes those uncomfortable experiences of being on that roller coaster and going up and down can feel really fresh and can be interesting to a reader. No one wants to read 400 pages of grief. It's hard. And no one wants to read one after the other, one-liners thrown at them. That's taxing. So the roller coasters are cool. And one of my favorite TV shows is the TV show The Wonder Years. And that's one of the things I loved about that show. Is in the same episode, you start out laughing at how cute these middle school kids are, and then you're like bawling, crying by the end of it. So you're doing that roller coaster.
Don't you think it makes a difference if you were raised in a family where humor was used just every day? My family, when they told something, it always came out funny.
Do people say you're funny?
It wasn't ha 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 funny, but it was subtly funny.
Do people call you funny? Do they? Tell me it's okay,
Oh,
right?
yeah, many times.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, my family expressed humor. I wonder about those people who were raised where that was not used. It would be more difficult,
I would think so.
My family used humor at the dinner table every night, and often we would have relatives from another part of the country who did not think we were funny. Okay? We thought we were funny. The other point I wanted to make about Micah's comment about Mark Twain, there has been a huge resurrection of Mark Twain in parts of California, in the acting community, the writers community, and interestingly, they're all very young. I know some of them, and they love
Very
Mark
cool.
Twain.
He's timeless.
He is timeless.
We have the same thing, where I live in Mandeville, across the lake from New Orleans. We have the Jane Austen Literary Festival. I was there selling books a couple of months ago. And it's the same kind of thing. There are young people there in the full, Edwardian costumes, and they've read all of Austen's books. And I love seeing that. It's not my kind of thing.
We also have.
I'm not into Mark Twain and Jane Austen.
We also have the Tennessee Williams Festival.
Yes, which is wonderful. I wish I had a Gabriel Garcia Marquez festival. That would make me very happy. Any other thoughts y'all want to comment on?
Let me ask you, where do you publish your essays or creative pieces besides your book?
That's a hard question because I probably have close to 1,500 published pieces now, all over the place. I've had stuff in the writer. I've read my work on NPR radio before. I do a lot of work for parenting magazines, simply because that's really easy and it's easy to write from personal experience. Everybody knows that, and they love that kind of stuff. Quick, lightweight, easy reads while moms are sitting there in the parking line or whatever. I don't know. I've dozens of places. And they're not all funny. I mean, I do some very serious stuff too.
Who published this last book?
This, my publisher is Quill Driver Books. They're in Fresno, California. They're a kind of medium-sized publishing house. I think probably their biggest, they don't have any big authors. Their biggest author is probably Dr. Ruth Westheimer. They have a lot of health titles, humor. Even though I said something negative about it earlier, they have a section at their website. If you go to quilldriverbooks.com and you click on, I think you click the humor section, they have a series of books for writers dealing with the exact things we're talking about today. There must be about 4 or 5 books about how to write humor. But yeah, they've been wonderful. It took a long time for me to get the book deal. It's kind of complicated, but the nonfiction essay collections by women humorists were very, very popular about 10 years ago, and it was all the rage. They were everywhere. Celia Ribbenbach and Jenny Lancaster, and they were everywhere. And that's about the time I started writing mine, and then by the time I was ready to go to market with the thing, because I worked on it for years, that was over. And most of the initial contacts I made with agents and publishers were, you're not famous, you're a nobody, so we can't publish this book. We love it, but you're just not famous. And right now, unless you have a name, it's not going to happen. So yeah, so it took a while, but eventually I got a contract with this little publisher out in California, and I even got an advance, which was awesome, and they've been wonderful. So I had no experience of dealing with the big 6, big 5 now, with the big 5 publishers, but I can tell you my experience with this medium-sized company has been really good because I got a lot of personal attention.
What about Quill? What about Quill? The
Quill.
publisher.
It's Quill Driver Books, Quill Driver BOOKS. And click on their humor section and some good books. And then there's another, actually, the only book of theirs that was on my shelf before I went with them is I had a book of theirs called Damn, Why Didn't I Write That? And it's a really inspirational book about people who have written weird little niche books about things that you would think nobody would ever read that thing. What were they thinking publishing that? But sometimes if you have a topic that is so niched, you actually can be way more successful with it. Books like this, like, okay, it appeals to women and they're, 40 on up to maybe 60, 65. That's it, that's my group. That's a pretty big niche, right? But if someone writes a book about toy trains from the 1800s, well, you would think that would be a total flop, right? Who wants to buy that book? But guess what? The guy who wrote that book, I'm making up the name, let's pretend that exists. Sure it does. He knows everywhere to go to sell his book. He goes to every train convention in the United States. He goes to every model train club. So that's what that Damn Why Didn't I Read That is about. Don't be scared to come up with the weirdest little niche product. If you have a game plan for marketing it, they can do so much better than things that have broad appeal, you know, like this, because this isn't niched enough. You know.